Okay, so we will get to the 1960s now. Hopefully everybody watched the video of Subterranean Homesick Blues by Bob Dylan. I will have two video lectures on the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Then I will have two on the counterculture in the 1960s, the second of which will focus on Bob Dylan. And then we will have a video lecture on the New Left, which is different from the counterculture. Down the road, we should have one on the Great Society. And then, of course, we'll have one on 1968. So as we get to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, first thing I mention, and I always mention this when I discuss civil rights, the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis is top notch. If you have a chance to go there, please do. I took my family. It was amazing. Best museum I've ever been in. Now, during the 60s, of course, there are many important organizations which come up. Some of them start in the 1950s, such as the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which we talked about when we discussed the 1950s. That, of course, was led by Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy. We also see SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was established by students from the North and South. One of the early leaders was Stokely Carmichael. We will revisit him when SNCC changes the nonviolent to national and becomes a little bit more radical later in the 60s. That'll be in part 2 of this video lecture. Carmichael literally wrote the book on Black Power, and he would later change his name to Kwame Ture and move to Africa. Another important group we see is CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. This was a group of Northern students led by James Farmer. They organized sit-ins, wade-ins at segregated swimming pools, and pray-ins at white-only churches. The methodology of the movement, of course, passive resistance, civil disobedience, Christian nonviolence, and it's you're not overemphasizing the Christianity part of this. King, of course, was a minister. He was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and those who knew him best said that he was most proud of the minister part of that. So, the Reverend aspect. We get to the 60s, we're going to get to the Birmingham campaign in a little bit, but first let's start with more of the passive resistance, some examples of the civil rights movement in action. Of course, the lunch counter sit-ins, which will begin February 1st, 1960, when 4 African-American college students walked up to a whites-only lunch counter at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. They asked for coffee. Service was refused. The students waited patiently. There were threats. There was intimidation. They continued to wait patiently. Now what goes on, many of you have seen these videos, and there's actually, the actual lunch counter is in that museum in Memphis, as well as some great footage. But the students were jeered, they were threatened, they were pelted with food, they were pelted with ketchup, with sugar. Some tried to provoke fights with these students, but again, they sat patiently. They practiced civil disobedience. If there was a physical attack, the student who was being attacked would then curl up into a ball on the floor and just take the punishment. When they were arrested, another line of students would come in and take their seats. The theory, of course, if violence is only on the part of the white community, then the world would see the righteousness of the cause. Again, they have the moral high ground here. Overall, 1,500 demonstrators would be arrested within the next few months. The South would slowly begin to abandon this part of segregation, and this would ultimately help to desegregate public facilities in over 140 cities and towns in the South. Another important event, or group of events, if you will, would be the Freedom Rides. Now, in 1961, interstate travel was still segregated, if you can imagine that. I mean, it's segregated in the South because, again, these states' rights, yada, yada, yada. So in 1961, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, organizes the first Freedom Rides. These were busloads of African American and white students who rode together through the South. They first left the District of Columbia in May of 1961 en route to New Orleans. Several participants were arrested in bus stations and often beaten up while they were in jail. There again are many images of these students before and after their jail sentences. When the buses reached Anniston, Alabama, an angry mob slashed the tires on one bus and set it on fire. The other bus was violently attacked. The riders had to complete the journey by plane. Again, there are many amazing images that you can find online from the Freedom Rides and the violence that these individuals faced. Attorney General Robert Kennedy would finally order federal marshals to protect the future freedom rides, and the Interstate Commerce Commission banned segregation on interstate travel shortly thereafter. But again, the images and the publicity that this generated, and we're going to get to the importance of publicity here in a minute, but it really opened the eyes of many when they saw students getting attacked on a bus, seeing buses set on fire, seeing students who have been physically attacked, black eyes, bloody faces, men and women. And then, of course, police officers in the South who would randomly beat them up. The next major event, and this is arguably the most important of these three, would be the Voter Education Project in 1962. SNCC led the way with this, though almost every major civil rights group participated. Basically, students went into Southwest Georgia, they went into Mississippi, and they, as it sounds, they tried to set up voter education. They tried to educate people on how they could register to vote, how to vote, etc. They often met with violence from white opposition, and they sought some help from the administration, but the Kennedy administration really offered nothing tangible in return, which was kind of the basic pattern of the Kennedy administration. They would only act on civil rights when they were forced to, really. We get to Freedom Summer, and again, this is students from the North come down to help register African Americans in the South to vote. They hold practice voter registration. Students, again, often met with severe violence from locals who would literally beat the students and the locals for even trying to attempt to register. Robert Paris Moses was one of the leaders of this movement. In Parting the Waters, which is, I think, the best book on the civil rights movement during the King years, Taylor Branch details what Robert Paris Moses faced. One particular instance, Moses walked up to the courthouse steps to register a Southern African American. The sheriff hit him with his stick. Robert Paris Moses stood up again, said, "I am here to register this person." The sheriff continued to beat him. Robert Paris Moses continued to stand up in the face of this aggression, eventually was able to get the person registered. But this is the kind of thing that they faced on a daily basis. And many of these students, again, they're from the North. They're in comfortable living situations, especially the white students who come down. They really put themselves on the line, really endanger themselves for this. The African American students who come down from the North, like Robert Paris Moses, obviously feel a much stronger connection because they've witnessed discrimination and racism and the impact it has on people's lives. Regardless, all of these efforts, no matter what, white or black, going down, facing this violence with no chance of defense, was quite brave, because oftentimes the people who denied these folks the right to vote were the same people who were in power. They were the sheriff, they were the town deputies, they might be the prosecuting attorney. And when these individuals went down there, they had no form of protection. The police did not protect them, and if anything, would turn the other way or even take part in the violence. If you've ever seen Mississippi Burning, this is a perfect example of what happened. That, of course, dealt with the 3 civil rights workers who went down to Mississippi to try to, again, educate people on voting rights, to try to work towards civil rights. They disappeared. They were found not guilty by a jury of whites, even though there was overwhelming proof that they were murdered by this group. But again, the group was comprised of city officials, of the sheriff, of police officers, and they were not going to be held accountable. So the bravery that these young men and women showed in going down to the South without protection to try to initiate change is really impressive. And I don't think it's anything that we can truly understand today. So going from Freedom Summer, we get to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was August 28th, 1963. This, of course, is the famous I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. This is 3 groups that helped to establish and promote this: SNCC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the NAACP. What was this about? Over 200,000 African American and white Americans came together for march, for speeches, for songs. Some of the people we see here: Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, John Lewis, Mahalia Jackson. This was about a message of hope. It was about optimism that these groups could work together and that they could work through the system for change. Again, King is very much the leader of this march. That is undisputed, and his speech, again, is the center of the march itself. An important part of this, which I'm not going to get into too much detail right now, but John Kennedy tried to stop the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He was unable. It went on as planned. But again, this just kind of reflects not necessarily the negativity of the Kennedy administration, but that maybe it wasn't as positive as many might argue, especially when it comes to civil rights. He ran on civil rights as a key part of his platform, but again, did very little in its favor. Now we get to the Birmingham campaign and a little bit of background. This is, again, I mean, if you want to look at the most important civil rights action, really, as far as a national scope, I would say it's the Birmingham campaign for a few reasons, which we'll get to toward the end. In January of 1963, George Wallace became the governor of Alabama. Again, not Henry Wallace. Wallace, in his speech when he becomes governor, says, quote, "I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Again, Wallace, this is his famous speech when he becomes governor. He becomes a hero to many in the South. And of course, when we get to 1968, he runs for president in 1968 and garners quite a bit of support. But he was somebody who was willing to stand up to progressives. And again, in the South, this probably wasn't too difficult. So what's going on here in Birmingham? There is a strong KKK presence. This is not necessarily a reaction to the civil rights movement, though it was certainly exacerbated by it. Just as we see in Mississippi, the KKK and its sympathizers are in the police department, they're in the local government. These are officials, Bull Connor being one example. And they are not going to allow for this kind of change. In Birmingham, after the end of World War II, between 1945 and 1963, there were 50 bombings in the city. Many of these targeted black churches. One black section of town was attacked so often it became known as Dynamite Hill. Segregation sentiment was strong. The city closed its system of public parks and its professional baseball team rather than allow blacks to participate. The city was run by a commission form of government, and each of the three commissioners was a hardline supporter of segregation. I mentioned Bull Connor. He was the public safety commissioner. The Birmingham campaign really made his name a household name. For some, he was a hero. For most, he was the antithesis of heroism. So Birmingham is the ideal target for the SCLC, for the movement itself. The goal here was to desegregate public facilities and to call attention to the treatment of African Americans in Birmingham. This was led by King, Reverends Fred Shuttlesworth, and James Bevel. It hit at Easter. The goal here was to make this public during the huge shopping season and to hopefully affect what businesses were earning. On April 3rd, 1963, we see some lunch counter sit-ins. There is a march on City Hall. There is an expressed boycott of downtown merchants. There are sit-ins at the library. There is a march on the county courthouse to register voters. A week later, on the 10th, the city government obtains a state court injunction against these protests, thereby denying them their right to congregate. The leaders of the movement decide to disobey the court order. 2 days later, on Good Friday, King is arrested for violating the anti-protest injunction. He is put in solitary confinement. This is where he writes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which we will get to here in a minute. He was denied the opportunity to call his wife at home, who had just given birth to their fourth child. His wife, Coretta, would contact the Kennedys, who would begrudgingly then ask Birmingham officials to allow him to call home. He would be released on bail April 20th. We're going to get to a letter from Birmingham jail here in a minute, its ideas and why it was so important. Within a month, May 2nd, more than 1,000 African-American students attempt to march into downtown. Hundreds would be arrested. The next day, Bull Connor directs local police and fire departments to use force to halt these demonstrations. And this is where you see the images of children being blasted by high pressure fire hoses, clubbed by police, attacked by dogs. This is covered by by TV stations, by newspaper, and it sparks outrage. Now, again, think of children being attacked by city officials. Again, this is despicable, but the attention that it garners is absolutely essential to the civil rights movement and the progress that it will make. I've mentioned this before, just as we see with the abolitionist movement, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Birmingham campaign, the fact that these images are on TVs throughout the country sparks outrage, leads many to realize things have to change down south. The Kennedys would send Burke Marshall, the chief civil rights assistant to Robert Kennedy. He would negotiate a deal. On May 10th, demonstrations halt. The city agrees to desegregate lunch counters, restrooms, drinking fountains, and department store fitting rooms within 90 days. They promise to hire more African Americans in the stores and to release hundreds of protesters on bond. This is, again, May 10th. These negotiations are they are made. The very next day, May 11th, a car bomb would damage the Gaston Motel where King and SCLC members were staying. The next day, on May 12th, King's brother's home was bombed. A few months later, September 15th, KKK members bombed Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 young black girls were killed. Again, the heathen actions by these people would only spur on the movement, would only embolden and empower those who are directly and indirectly involved in the movement. Now, I want to get to the letter from Birmingham jail, which again, King wrote from the Birmingham jail. This would later be part of his larger work, Why We Can't Wait. Why was he there? Again, these nonviolent Birmingham protests over segregation, Alabama state law against mass public demonstrations, and he was denied his permit. Who is he writing to? Many mistakenly think that he's writing this to the white leaders of town or to the country as a whole, but he was focusing this letter on the ministers in Birmingham, the African American ministers who were more concerned about the demonstrations than they were about what caused them. He called for direct action to spur negotiations. Why was King criticized by these clergymen? Why did they criticize Birmingham movement again? They wanted to deal with civil rights in court, which was part of the civil rights movement, of course, the NAACP, the legal wing. But for many, there's a realization this isn't working out as quickly or as well as we want it to. They would ask for patience, and King's reply to further calls for patience, again, is to take action immediately. What theme keeps coming up in his letter? Religion. To King, this is the key justification for why segregation and discrimination are wrong. And why is this considered such an important piece of literature? Again, think about the totality of the situation, the context, 1963 Birmingham, what's going on, the fact that he is pointing out to his fellow civil rights leaders that we need to take action right now. And obviously, he was a very articulate individual. He was well-spoken, well-written, like few others of his time. I'm not saying he was a well-spoken African-American. He was a well-spoken person. He gave great speeches. He was charismatic. He was energetic. People were drawn to him. And this comes through in his letter from Birmingham jail. One of the famous lines that comes from this, and this is one of the ways, how does he justify his presence in Birmingham? He doesn't live in Birmingham. And the famous line that he provides here, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He also states justice too long delayed is justice denied. He calls up history in his letter. He brings up the idea of civil disobedience that was practiced in the Bible. He brings up Socrates. He brings up the Boston Tea Party. So he is really reaching out to people in a very direct way, connecting with them in ways that are important to them. Again, Christianity, history, American history, and the Boston Tea Party particularly. Again, for King, this transcends localism, and this very much brought more attention to the civil rights movement. This publicity was absolutely essential. And one of the other points he brings up, if one man is not free, are any of us free? Now, real quick, before we kind of get on to another part of at least this era, and that's the idea of Kennedy on civil rights. For many historians, they argue for Kennedy it was more about politics, not so much about morals. He realizes that he needed the African American vote to become president, that he needed that to sustain his presidency. Think about the fact he tried to stop the March on Washington. He was hesitant in insisting in many of the actions of the movements in the South. One example being in Albany. The Kennedys came to play when it pushed up against their political credibility. If they weren't forced, they did little. Robert may have been different. 1968 is an example after the King assassination. We'll get to that here shortly in a few weeks. But again, the movement espoused civil disobedience, Christian nonviolence. It was making inroads. King brought more attention to the cause, but in many ways, Southern whites did as good a job as the protesters by bringing attention. Bull Connor, again known throughout the country after the Birmingham campaign, not in a good way for most. But not everyone was embracing King's methods. A more militant African-American voice was developing and would grow stronger as the decade moved on. And in part two of this lecture, we will get more to Black Power, but real quick right now I want to bring up Malcolm X. One of his more famous discussions or speeches was The Ballot or the Bullet. His autobiography, if you have a chance to read it, it is excellent. It's very eye-opening as far as how Malcolm X evolved. Many believe he favored violence, not necessarily, especially toward the end of his life, but we'll get to that here in a minute. So the ballot or the bullet, what does this mean? Of course, for Malcolm X or Malcolm Little, born in Omaha, Nebraska, that we needed to make change however we needed to make change, whether it be through the ballot or through the bullet. He promoted a sense of black nationalism, economic self-sufficiency, racial pride, separatism. He states at one point in The Ballot or the Bullet, quote, "We must learn to forget our differences," but he's not necessarily forgetting these differences. He is really only focusing on them. And this really gets to kind of a larger question. But later in his life, again, he becomes more accepting. One phrase appears in this speech that would become kind of key to understanding Malcolm X and the Black Power movement, and that was the quote, "by whatever means necessary." Again, this gets back to the title of the speech, "The Ballot or the Bullet." We do whatever is necessary. For Malcolm X, as well as many of these other people who espouse Black Power, they believed the civil rights movement under King was naive, that it was too slow, it was too idealistic, and that we needed to take action directly, and again, by whatever means necessary. And this gets into one of the larger divides that we even see earlier, which I had mentioned between Du Bois and Washington, the idea of accommodationism versus separatism. King and his followers wanted to accommodate, wanted to work through the system, even if that was a little bit slow, even though, again, his letter from Birmingham jail calls for direct action. But for folks like Malcolm X and later on Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, these people are separatists. They believe we need to form our own community, we need to form our own independence, our own self-sufficiency, and from there we can truly say that we are equal. Now, for Malcolm X, again, if you read his autobiography, after his pilgrimage, he recognized that whites and African Americans could work together. And this tamed some of his radicalism. He would start the OAAU, the Organization for Afro-American Unity. One last thing, of course, who killed Malcolm X? 3 Nation of Islam members. The infighting within the left part of the civil rights movement, if you will, very much decimated its core, minimized its, the impact that it could make on it is unfortunate, obviously. So, all right, well, we will get to part 2 of the 60s and the civil rights movement here in a bit.